Scott Peterson. On Christmas Eve of 2002, a man in Modesto, California, picked up the phone and reported that his wife had vanished. She was 27, and she was roughly 8 months pregnant with their first son. He told the police he had spent that morning fishing alone, more than 90 miles from home. It was the kind of story anyone might tell. At least, that was how it sounded at first. Months before Laci Peterson disappeared, her husband Scott had quietly begun building a life that left no room for her. In late November, he had started an affair with a massage therapist named Amber Frey. By the first week of December, weeks before Laci was ever reported missing, he was already describing himself to people as a man who had lost his wife, speaking about his marriage in the past tense. Around the same time, he made a quiet purchase that almost nobody in his life knew about: a small aluminum fishing boat. Prosecutors would later argue he also built homemade concrete anchors in his warehouse. The state's theory was disturbing in its calmness. They believed Scott ended Laci's life inside their own home, then drove her weighted body to the Berkeley Marina and lowered it into San Francisco Bay. After that, he returned to Modesto and did something that still unsettles people who follow the case. He reported her missing. He stood beside her family. He helped organize the searches and let candlelight vigils be held for a woman he already knew would never be found alive. You'd think someone close to the couple would have raised the alarm about the way he was talking. A few did. Nobody could prove what it meant until the Bay gave Laci back. Amber Frey did not stay silent for long. On December 30th, only days after Laci was reported missing, Frey contacted Modesto police and told them she had been seeing Scott, who had presented himself to her as a single man. She agreed to record their phone calls, and those recordings captured a man lying with unsettling ease, reassuring his mistress while his pregnant wife was still officially a missing person. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The case would turn on the tide itself. In the middle of April 2003, the remains of the couple's unborn son washed ashore along the Richmond shoreline. A day later, Laci's remains surfaced in the same area, only a few miles from the spot where Scott had claimed to be fishing. On April 18th, police arrested him near a golf course outside San Diego. He had bleached his dark hair blonde and grown a goatee. In his car, they found around $15,000 in cash, his brother's identification, and camping gear. The kind of supplies a man gathers when he is preparing to disappear rather than run a quick errand. The trial was moved to Redwood City to find an impartial jury, and it stretched from June to November of 2004. Prosecutors called more than 170 witnesses, building a case made entirely of circumstance, because there was no confession and no eyewitness. On November 12, 2004, the jury convicted Scott of first-degree murder in Laci's death and second-degree murder in the death of their son, whom the couple had planned to name Connor. The jury then recommended death, and the following spring, he was formally sentenced to die. The story did not end there. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence, ruling that potential jurors had been improperly dismissed over their personal views on capital punishment. He was resentenced to life without parole in December of 2021. In early 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project took up his case, arguing that the entire conviction rested on circumstance and that new evidence deserved a fresh look. But in April of 2026, a judge dismissed all 14 of their claims, finding nothing new, admissible, or material in what they presented. The project pushed back hard, calling the ruling a fundamental misreading of the law, and announced it would appeal to a higher court. As of today, Scott Peterson remains at Mule Creek State Prison, still insisting he is innocent, while a separate petition over alleged juror misconduct sits before the state's highest court. Peterson's plan revealed itself in small, quiet purchases made weeks ahead of time. The next man left a paper trail of an entirely different kind, and by the time the bodies were found, he was already on another continent. Neil Entwistle. 2 days after his wife and their infant daughter were found dead in their rented home outside Boston, Neil Entwistle was not at the funeral home, and he was not helping the police. He was more than 3,000 miles away in England. He told everyone he had gone home to grieve with family. So why had he booked a one-way ticket out of the country before anyone even knew his family was dead? Hopkinton, Massachusetts, January of 2006. On the surface, the Entwistles looked like a young family chasing the American dream. Neil had moved from England with his wife Rachel, and the two had a baby daughter. He told people he was earning around $10,000 a month through an offshore investment account. None of it was true. In reality, Neil was unemployed, buried under more than $30,000 in credit card debt, and quietly running internet fraud and escort schemes just to stay afloat. He had also told Rachel that the offshore account was paying him handsomely, when in truth, there was no income at all. The comfortable life he projected was a performance, and it was collapsing by the day. On January 20th, 2006, inside that rented home, Rachel and the couple's baby daughter lost their lives. Investigators would later uncover the kind of planning that pointed away from any sudden loss of control. On Neil's computer, they found searches for how to take a life using a knife, alongside searches about how to end his own life. The weapon used was a handgun that belonged to Rachel's stepfather, which Neil had access to and which he returned afterward. Prosecutors believed Neil had intended a murder-suicide and had carried out only the first half before his nerve failed. And somehow, the story he told afterward only gets worse. The bodies were discovered by police on January 22nd after concerned relatives asked them to check the house. By then, Neil had already left the country. The case was led by District Attorney Martha Coakley, and the search for Neil quickly crossed the Atlantic. In early February, officers from London's Metropolitan Police located him at an underground station in the city, at Royal Oak, and took him into custody without incident. He waived his right to fight extradition and was returned to Massachusetts in the middle of February to face the charges. The story he and his family told was that Rachel had taken the lives of herself and the baby, and that Neil had simply panicked and fled in his grief. Prosecutors saw it very differently. They pointed to the mounting debts, the elaborate lies about his income, the dark internet searches, and above all, to the decision to board a one-way flight rather than call for help. A grieving, innocent husband does not, as a rule, leave his family behind and fly to another country. Neil was indicted in late March of 2006, and his trial opened in June of 2008 in Middlesex Superior Court. On June 25, 2008, the jury convicted him on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. His conviction was automatically appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, where his lawyers argued that the searches of the home and his computer had been improper. The court rejected the argument and upheld the conviction, and a petition to the United States Supreme Court was turned away in early 2013. In the years since, Neil has continued filing motions on his own, complaining about a juror who gave a television interview after the trial, and about a jury experiment carried out during deliberations. None of it has changed the outcome. As of today, he remains held at the Old Colony Correctional Center in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. While his parents continue to insist that Rachel was responsible and that their son is innocent. Entwistle's planning lived in his browser history and a single plane ticket. The next case took preparation to a level investigators rarely see, mapped out across state lines with gas cans, a rented car, and a brand new hair color. Jodi Arias. Before she drove to see her former boyfriend in Mesa, Arizona, Jodi Arias rented a car far from her hometown, gathered enough fuel that she would never have to stop at a gas station, and changed her hair from blonde to brunette. Within days, Travis Alexander would be dead. And then Arias started telling a story about what happened. Then a second story. Then a third. By the spring of 2008, Travis Alexander, a 30-year-old salesman, had ended his on-and-off relationship with Arias. He had moved on. Arias had not. Friends of Alexander would later say they had warned him that she frightened them, that she seemed to be following him and showing up where she was not wanted. What looked from the outside like a difficult breakup was, according to prosecutors, the beginning of a methodical plan. On the 28th of May, a handgun was reported stolen from her grandparents' home in Eureka, California, where Arias had been staying at the time. Within days, the pieces of her preparation began clicking into place. On the 2nd of June, Arias rented a car, notably not from her local area, and set out on a long, circuitous drive. She borrowed 2 gas cans from a former boyfriend and bought a third, filling all of them so she could cross Arizona without ever leaving a record at a fuel pump. In plain terms, she made sure she could travel an entire state without anyone documenting that she had ever been there. She dyed her hair and turned off her phone once she was inside Arizona. On June 4th, inside Alexander's home, he was attacked and did not survive. His body was not discovered for 5 days when worried friends found him. The county medical examiner would later testify about the cause of death at trial, and the scene made clear this had not been quick or impersonal. Still, the prosecution's focus stayed fixed on everything Arias had done to reach him undetected, because that preparation was what separated a crime of passion from a crime of premeditation. Investigators then caught an enormous break inside the house. A digital camera had been run through the washing machine in an apparent attempt to destroy it. But technicians recovered deleted, time-stamped images from that day. Some showed Alexander alive in the early afternoon. Others were accidental photographs taken during the attack itself. There was also a bloody palm print that matched Arias, carrying a mix of her DNA and Alexander's. Faced with all of it, Arias changed her account again and again. First, she claimed she had never been there at all. Then she blamed 2 masked intruders. Finally, she settled on self-defense, each version collapsing as more evidence came in. Arias was indicted in July of 2008 and arrested days later. Her trial began in January of 2013, and it became a national spectacle, televised gavel to gavel, with viewers around the country following every reversal in her testimony. Arias herself spent days on the stand, an unusual and risky choice for a defendant. On May 8, 2013, the jury found her guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The penalty phase, though, fractured. The first jury could not agree on a sentence, and a second penalty jury, seated across 2014 and 2015, also deadlocked, reportedly 11-1 in favor of death. That deadlock took capital punishment off the table. On April 13, 2015, Judge Sherry Stevens sentenced Arias to life without the possibility of parole, pointing to the cruelty of the crime and the substantial planning and preparation behind it. In in March of 2020, the Arizona Court of Appeals upheld her conviction. As of today, Jodi Arias is held at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville, and she has signaled that she intends to keep fighting for post-conviction relief. Arias built her plan out in the open, on highways and at checkout counters, betting that nobody would connect the dots. The next man did almost the opposite. He planned in private, then stepped in front of television cameras and begged the world to help him find the family he had already taken. Chris Watts. In August of 2018, a soft-spoken man in Frederick, Colorado, stood near his own home in front of news cameras and pleaded for the safe return of his pregnant wife and their 2 young daughters. He said the house felt empty without them. He said he just wanted them home. But he already knew they were never coming home because he was the reason they were gone. From the outside, Shanann and Chris Watts looked like a family on solid ground. Shanann was 34, pregnant with a baby boy they planned to name Nico, and the couple had 2 little girls. But behind the cheerful social media posts, the marriage was failing. Chris had begun an affair with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger, and he had quietly started imagining a future without his wife and children in it. A future where the debts and the strain and the marriage simply disappeared. He would later admit that this future had been forming in his mind far longer than anyone realized. The planning showed itself in the ordinary errands of that final morning. Before the day was over, Chris had contacted his daughter's school to withdraw them, and he had reached out to a realtor about selling the family home. Early on the morning of August 13, 2018, inside their house, he took Shanann's life. He then drove his daughters roughly 40 minutes away to a remote oil work site connected to his job. And there, the 2 girls also lost their lives. He concealed all 3 of them at the site before returning home and reporting his family missing. In letters written later from prison, he claimed he had been planning their deaths for weeks. At first, Chris leaned into the role of the worried husband, even giving local television interviews asking for his family to come home. But the story unraveled almost immediately. What came next is the part that still does not make sense to a lot of people. A neighbor's surveillance camera captured footage that contradicted his account of that morning. An agent with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, Tammy Lee, sat across from him as the inconsistencies piled up. On August 15th, he failed a polygraph examination. Cornered, he confessed, though his first version was another lie. He told his own father that Shanann had harmed the girls and that he had reacted in a rage, attempting even then to shift the blame onto his late wife. The physical evidence and his own later statements dismantled that claim. He eventually led investigators to where he had hidden the bodies. There was no lengthy trial. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder under an agreement that took the death penalty off the table. Prosecutors later explained that Shanann's family had supported the deal, preferring certainty over the long uncertainty of a capital trial and its endless appeals. He was given 5 life sentences, without the possibility of parole. 3 of them ordered to run consecutively, a structure that guarantees he can never be released, no matter how the legal landscape shifts. The man who had stood outside his home, asking strangers for help finding his family, was now going to spend the rest of his life in prison for ending their lives. His case became the subject of a widely watched documentary, American Murder: The Family Next Door, which drew much of its power from the contrast between Shanann's own cheerful videos and what was really happening inside the home. His prison correspondence has continued to draw attention as well, including his own shifting accounts of exactly how that morning unfolded. Those later claims, made by a man who has already proven himself a liar, are treated by investigators as his words rather than as established fact. As of today, Chris Watts remains incarcerated at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Walpin, Wisconsin, where he is serving his sentences with no path to release. Watts hid his planning behind the face of a desperate father. The next man hid his behind a police badge, and by the time anyone took a hard look at him, one wife was dead, another had vanished, and he was still walking free. Drew Peterson. Drew Peterson was a police sergeant in Bolingbrook, Illinois, a man who spent his career on what was supposed to be the right side of the law. He was also married 4 times. His third wife was found dead in a dry bathtub just before their divorce was finalized. His fourth wife disappeared and has never been found. For years, he treated all of it like a joke. The justice system eventually stopped laughing. In March of 2004, Kathleen Savio, Drew's third wife, was found dead in the bathtub of her home, weeks before a hearing that would have divided their finances in the divorce. Their marriage had been marked by repeated domestic disturbance calls, and Savio had told people she feared what Drew might do to her. At the time, though, a coroner's jury ruled her death an accidental drowning, and Drew moved on. He soon married again, this time to a much younger woman named Stacy. The ruling in Savio's death rested on a quiet assumption that it had been nothing more than a tragic accident. That assumption was a warning sign in plain view, and everyone ignored it. On October 28, 2007, Stacy Peterson vanished. Drew suggested she had simply run off with another man. Almost nobody who knew her believed it. Her disappearance forced investigators to look again at Kathleen Savio, and her body was exhumed for a second autopsy. This time, a renowned forensic pathologist found bruising and injuries consistent with a staged scene rather than an accidental fall. Around the same period, Drew's own stepbrother came forward with a chilling account. He said he had helped Drew carry a large blue barrel out of the home, a barrel heavy enough to require 2 men, one that felt warm to the touch. That barrel has never been found. Stacy's case gave the Savio investigation new life, but it also created a legal problem. The strongest evidence against Drew was what the women in his life had said before they were gone. And ordinarily, those statements would not be allowed in court because they counted as hearsay. Illinois responded by passing a new statute, informally nicknamed after Drew himself, that allowed statements from dead or unavailable witnesses to be heard under certain conditions, on the theory that a man should not be able to silence a witness and then benefit from that silence in court. Jurors would later say those statements, the words of Kathleen and Stacy reaching them after both women were gone, were the most damning evidence they heard. Drew was arrested in May of 2009, and his bond was set at $20 million. On September 6, 2012, a jury convicted Drew Peterson of first-degree murder in Kathleen Savio's death. And the following February, he was sentenced to 38 years. Now, Drew could have stopped there. He didn't. And somehow, it gets worse. While behind bars at the Menard prison, he tried to arrange the death of the very prosecutor who had put him away, a man named James Glasgow. The inmate he approached refused to go along with it, went to the authorities, and agreed to wear a wire to capture Drew's instructions. In 2016, Drew was convicted of soliciting murder and handed an additional 40 years to be served consecutively to the sentence he was already serving. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld his murder conviction in 2017. He has since filed his own petitions claiming poor legal representation and witness intimidation, and that litigation, including a court-ordered evaluation of his fitness, carried on into recent years. But nothing has moved him closer to freedom. Now in his 70s, he is reportedly held at a prison in Michigan City, Indiana. and given his combined sentences, he will almost certainly die behind bars. Stacy Peterson has never been found, and to this day, he has never been charged in connection with her disappearance. 5 people, 5 plans laid carefully in advance. But the cases that follow push the idea of premeditation even further into forged signatures, poisoned drinks, text messages signed like a pair of outlaws, and a courtroom dynasty that believed it was untouchable. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Robert Durst. 3 people close to Robert Durst met violent ends across 3 decades, and for most of that time, the wealthy real estate heir simply walked away from each one. His first wife vanished without a trace. His closest confidant was found shot inside her own home. His neighbor's remains turned up in a bay off the Texas coast. So how did a man surrounded by so much death stay free for nearly 20 years? Durst was born into one of New York's richest real estate families. A man who never wanted for anything and never seemed to answer for anything either. On January 31st, 1982, his first wife, Kathy, disappeared. She was eventually declared dead, though her body was never found. And for years, the case simply faded into rumor. Durst carried on, insulated by money and a family name that opened every door in the city. To anyone watching, he was untouchable, and he seemed to know it. The story might have stayed buried in that silence, except the past refused to cooperate. By late 2000, New York investigators had reopened the question of what happened to Kathy, and they wanted to speak with Durst's closest friend, a woman named Susan Berman, who had long acted as his unofficial spokesperson. Berman knew things. Around December 23, 2000, just as that interview drew near, she was found shot in the back of the head inside her Los Angeles home. Prosecutors would later argue Durst silenced her to keep her from talking. And a jury eventually agreed, finding that he had lain in wait and acted to remove a witness. There was more tying him to her death than motive alone. A note had been sent to police directing them to Berman's body, and it misspelled the word Beverly in the address in the exact same unusual way Durst had once misspelled it in a letter to her. This is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Less than a year later, in Galveston, Texas, Durst was living in disguise as a mute woman to avoid attention from anyone who might recognize the man now linked to 2 missing or dead people. In the autumn of 2001, his neighbor, Morris Black, lost his life, and Durst concealed the body and disposed of it in Galveston Bay. He was caught, he was tried, and in 2003 he was acquitted of the crime after telling the jury he had acted in self-defense during a struggle. A man connected to 3 deaths had now beaten the most serious charge against him in open court in front of everyone. If he had simply faded into the background after that, this might be a very different story. What finally cornered him was a camera. In 2015, a documentary series called The Jinx put Durst on screen and confronted him with a handwriting match on that note. During a break, still wearing a live microphone, he muttered to himself something that sounded like an admission that he had been responsible for all of them. His lawyers would later argue his words had been edited and taken out of context. The night before that final episode aired, Durst was arrested in New Orleans. His Los Angeles trial began in March of 2020, then stalled for 14 months when the pandemic shut the courts down. It resumed in May of 2021, and prosecutors finally laid out the full pattern: the disappearance, the friend who knew too much, the note in his handwriting. On September 17, 2021, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder in Susan Berman's death. and the following month he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Days later, New York finally charged him with Kathy's death, more than 39 years after she vanished. He never truly answered for any of it. On January 10, 2022, only months after his conviction, Robert Durst died in custody at the age of 78. Because his appeal was still pending when he died, his murder conviction was automatically vacated under California law, leaving the official record, in the strictest legal sense, unfinished, and the families of his victims without the final word they had waited decades to hear. Durst used wealth and disguises to stay ahead of the law for decades. The woman in the next case needed neither, only a teenager willing to do something unthinkable on her behalf. Pamela Smart. In the spring of 1990, a young school employee in New Hampshire stood in front of news cameras as a grieving widow, asking the public for help finding whoever had broken into her home and taken her husband's life. She was poised, tearful, and convincing. What nobody watching knew was that the man's death had been arranged from inside his own marriage. If you had asked anyone at Winnacunnet High School about Pamela Smart back then, they would have described a polished, ambitious young media coordinator with a bright future. She was married to an insurance agent named Greg Smart, and to the people around them, they looked like an ordinary young couple. Behind that image, though, Pamela had begun a secret and deeply inappropriate relationship with a student at the school, and she used the trust and authority of her position to draw him in. Over time, prosecutors said, she did something far darker than carry on a secret relationship. She convinced that teenager to take her husband's life, warning him that a divorce would cost her the condo, her money, and even her dog. She pulled several of his friends into the plan as well. On May 1st, 1990, the group entered the Smarts' condo in Derry. Greg was forced to his knees, and he lost his life, with the scene staged afterward to look like a burglary gone wrong. For a short while, the cover story held, and Pamela kept playing the part of the shattered wife in front of cameras and neighbors alike. It came apart because of a recording. A teenage intern named Cecilia Pierce knew about the plot, and after a tip reached investigators, she agreed to wear a hidden wire. Over the summer of 1990, those recordings captured Pamela making incriminating statements and coaching Pierce on exactly what to say if anyone asked questions. On August 1st, 1990, Pamela Smart was arrested. Her trial became one of the first in the country broadcast from gavel to gavel, and the nation watched, transfixed, as a young widow was recast in real time as the architect of her own husband's death. Over 14 days, prosecutors laid out how she had orchestrated everything from a safe distance, letting others take the risk while she kept her own hands clean. On March 22, 1991, she was convicted of being an accomplice to first-degree murder, along with conspiracy and witness tampering. The sentence was mandatory and absolute: life without the possibility of parole. The young men who carried it out did not face the same fate. The one who had taken Greg's life and one of his companions pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for their testimony against Pamela, and both were paroled in 2015, having served their sentences. The others involved served their time and were released as well. Pamela, the one who had set the entire thing in motion, remained the only person locked away for the rest of her life, the only one for whom the door never opened again. In the decades since, she has fought that outcome from every angle and lost at every turn. Her appeals were exhausted. Request after request to have her sentence reduced or commuted was denied, including the most recent one, which Governor Kelly Ayotte rejected in May of 2025. For most of those years, Pamela insisted she had played no part in the death and had only been guilty of the relationship. Then, in a recorded statement released in June of 2024, she accepted responsibility for her husband's death for the very first time. In late 2025, she filed a new petition arguing her constitutional rights had been violated. As of today, Pamela Smart remains held at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York. Her case left such a mark on the culture that it inspired a best-selling novel and a major film, both built around a woman who manipulates the people around her into doing the unthinkable. Smart turned someone close to her into a weapon and stayed in the shadows. The next case crossed an ocean, and the two people who planned it barely tried to hide at all. Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer. When a taxi driver outside a luxury resort in Bali noticed a dark fluid seeping from a heavy suitcase his two foreign passengers had abandoned in his trunk, he had no idea he was about to unravel a crime that had been set in motion an ocean away. The travelers had walked off without paying their fare. Inside that suitcase was the body of a wealthy American woman, and the daughter who had checked into the hotel with her had helped put her there. The woman was Sheila von Wiese Mack, a 62-year-old Chicago widow traveling with her daughter, Heather, and Heather's boyfriend, Tommy Schaefer. From the outside, it might have looked like a family vacation. In reality, the relationship between mother and daughter had been volatile and toxic for years, with police called to their home dozens of times over the course of Heather's life. What turned that dysfunction into a plan was money. Sheila had set up a trust worth roughly $1.5 million. Money Heather stood to inherit on a schedule that paid out small amounts until she was older and then released the balance. Prosecutors said Heather had floated the idea of ending her mother's life as early as February of 2014, months before the trip. She offered Schaefer $50,000, secretly booked his flight to Bali using her own mother's credit card, and the two traded tense messages as the trip approached, hiding their meaning behind innocent-sounding phrases and casting themselves as a modern Bonnie and Clyde. And no, I'm not making that up. Schaefer's cousin, a young man named Robert Bibbs, even advised the couple from back home on how to carry it out, which would later put him in the crosshairs of American prosecutors too. On August 12, 2014, at the St. Regis Bali, the plan became real. Schaefer attacked Sheila inside the hotel room, and she did not survive. The two then forced her body into a large suitcase, loaded it into the trunk of a waiting taxi, and walked back inside, intending to slip away. When they failed to return and the driver spotted blood, he alerted hotel security and the police. Both Heather and Tommy were arrested the very next day. Their trials played out in the Indonesian courts in 2015, drawing intense coverage on both sides of the world. Schaefer was convicted of murder and sentenced to 18 years. Heather was convicted as an accessory and given 10. While in custody in Indonesia, she gave birth to a daughter, a child who would spend her earliest years tangled in the aftermath of this story. For a while, it seemed the case was closed, an ocean away. But that was only round one. American prosecutors were not finished with Heather Mack. She served around 7 years, was deported, and the moment she landed at O'Hare in November of 2021, she was arrested on a United States indictment charging her with conspiracy to kill an American citizen. She pleaded guilty in June of 2023, and on January 17, 2024, a federal judge named Matthew Kennelly sentenced her to 26 years, with credit for the time she had already served. She's now held at a medium security facility in West Virginia, with a projected release somewhere around the year 2044. Robert Bibbs, the cousin who advised them, received 9 years of his own. For more than a decade, Schaefer remained behind bars in Indonesia, and it looked like he might simply serve his time and disappear. Then, in February of 2026, after roughly 11 years, he was released and deported. He did not walk free for long. On February 25, 2026, the moment he arrived in Chicago, federal agents arrested him on conspiracy and obstruction charges. His American case is still working its way through the courts. Mack and Schaefer planned a death for money and left a trail almost too obvious to believe. The next woman planned hers with a chemist's patience and then wrote a children's book about grief. Kouri Richins. A little over a year after her husband died suddenly in their Utah home, Kouri Richins sat down for a cheerful local television interview to promote a children's book she had written. It was a book about helping kids cope with the loss of a parent, inspired, she said, by her own 3 boys. She had cast herself as a grieving widow, turning pain into something good. The timing of all of it would soon look very different. She went on television to sell that story. She should not have. Eric Richins was 39, a successful stonemasonry business owner, and by every account, a devoted father. Long before his death, he had grown afraid of his own wife. Back in 2020, he had quietly consulted divorce and estate lawyers, telling them he believed Kouri was misusing and draining his finances. He took steps to protect himself, removing her as the beneficiary of his life insurance and placing his business and estate into a trust controlled by his sister. He was, in effect, building a wall around his money to keep her out of it. He had good reason. A forensic accountant later testified that by the spring of 2022, Kouri was buried under roughly $7.5 million in debt, and she had become involved with another man. In January of 2022, she took out a life insurance policy on Eric worth more than $2 million, allegedly forging his signature to do it. Around the same time, investigators found searches on her devices asking how much fentanyl it would take to be fatal. And if the forged policy had been the only red flag, she might have explained it away. But there were the earlier incidents. Eric had told family members he believed Kouri had tried to poison him before, once after a drink on a trip to Greece, and again on Valentine's Day of 2022, when a sandwich left him struggling to breathe and reaching for an EpiPen. She would later be convicted of attempted murder for that Valentine's Day episode. The source of the drug eventually came into the light. The family's housekeeper, a woman named Carmen Lauber, testified under immunity in early 2026 that she had sold Kouri illicit pills on several occasions, and that Kouri had specifically asked for the strongest, most dangerous product she could get. The prosecutor told the jury that she wanted it precisely because it was lethal. On March 4, 2022, Kouri said she made Eric a cocktail, a Moscow Mule, before bed. He died during the night. A medical examiner determined that Eric had 5 times the lethal dose of illicit fentanyl in his system. It's not a typo, by the way. 5 times the amount needed to end a life, taken by mouth. With a pathologist testifying there was no natural explanation for his death. Eric's family had pushed hard for scrutiny when the official story did not add up, refusing to accept that a healthy 39-year-old man had simply died in his sleep. And that pressure paid off. On May 8, 2023, Kouri Richins was arrested on charges of aggravated murder and drug offenses. Her trial began in February of 2026 in Park City. And in a striking show of confidence, her defense called no witnesses at all. It did not matter. On March 16, 2026, after only a few hours of deliberation, the jury convicted her of aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, insurance fraud, and forgery. On May 13, 2026, on what would have been Eric's 44th birthday, she was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The judge, Richard Marazic, said plainly that a person who would do what she had done was simply too dangerous to ever be free again. Corey still insists she is innocent and intends to appeal, and she faces a separate set of financial crime charges on top of everything else. Richens hid a poisoning behind a book about grief. The final case is the one where the man accused of the crime came from the very family that had run the local justice system for generations. Alex Murdaugh. For more than a century, the Murdaugh name ran the law across a stretch of the South Carolina Lowcountry. They were the prosecutors and the attorneys, the family that helped decide who got charged and who walked away. Alex Murdaugh was the heir to all of it, a prominent lawyer with a sprawling estate and a life that looked untouchable from the outside. At least, that was the picture, right up until the night his wife and son lost their lives. But this story does not start with that night. It starts with money. The cracks had been spreading for a long time. On February 24th, 2019, Alex's younger son, Paul, drunkenly crashed the family's boat, and a 19-year-old passenger named Mallory Beach lost her life. Paul was charged, and the Beach family filed a wrongful death lawsuit that threatened to pry open Alex's finances in front of the world. That was a serious problem, because those finances were a crime scene of their own. For years, Alex had been stealing millions of dollars from his own clients and his law firm. On the morning of June 7th, 2021, the firm's chief financial officer, Jean Seckinger, confronted him about nearly $800,000 in fees that had gone missing. She later testified that he gave her a cold, dirty look and asked her what she needed from him now, as if she were the inconvenience. A hearing in the Beach lawsuit, one that could have exposed everything, was set for just 3 days later. The clock was already ticking, and Alex could hear it. That night, June 7th, 2021, Maggie and Paul Murdaugh lost their lives at the family's hunting property at Moselle. Alex called 911 and said he had come home to find them after visiting his ailing mother. It was a carefully built alibi, and it might have held. Pay attention to this next detail, because it is the one that explains everything. Paul had been recording a short video at the dog kennels just minutes before he and his mother were attacked. In the background of that recording was a voice. It was Alex, placing him at the scene at the exact moment he swore he was somewhere else. Even his own defenders struggled to explain that one away. State investigators built their case around that recording, and the lead prosecutor, Creighton Waters, argued that Alex had taken the lives of his own family to buy himself sympathy and distract from his looming financial ruin. The trial ran from late January into early March of 2023 in Walterboro. On March 2, 2023, the jury convicted Alex Murdaugh on 2 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The financial crimes piled on top of that. He later pleaded guilty to 22 state charges and 22 federal charges, drawing decades more in prison and in order to repay more than $8.5 million. It should have been the end. But the case was not nearly as finished as it looked. Murdaugh's defense had long alleged that the Colleton County Clerk of Court, a woman named Rebecca Hill, had improperly influenced the jury during the trial. At first, a judge rejected the claim. Then, in December of 2025, Hill pleaded guilty to obstruction, perjury, and misconduct in office. And on May 13, 2026, The South Carolina Supreme Court unanimously threw out Murdaugh's murder convictions, ruling that the clerk had effectively put her thumb on the scales of justice. So where does that leave him today? In the strictest legal sense, Alex Murdaugh is not currently a convicted murderer. The state's attorney general has said he intends to retry the case, and that every option, including the death penalty, remains on the table. For now, Murdaugh stays behind bars on his financial convictions, awaiting a second murder trial, and he has even filed his own federal lawsuit against the clerk whose actions undid the verdict. He continues to insist he had nothing to do with the deaths of his wife and son. 10 different people, 10 plans, one shared belief that they were clever enough to get away with it. Most of them are still behind bars tonight. A few of these cases are not even finished. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.